This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But, most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 54 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. Today is Thursday, June 15th, 2017. My name is Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Just a quick reminder before we get started, there's still 1 day left to take the survey at survey.libsyn.com/Naked Mormonism Podcast. If you took that, it would definitely help out the show in the long run, and I'd deeply appreciate it. Thanks so much. On this week's episode, we'll be talking about the PR nightmare that was the Spalding theory, as it embodied a new resurgence in the public eye. After that, we'll be talking a little bit about some feedback that we received about the Charone episode from last week, in specifically a Patreon segment about religious exemptions. But before doing that, just a little bit of house cleaning here. In order to create a little more consistency with what you'll hear in each episode, instead of doing one hour and a half long history episode every 2 weeks and then having a conversation or a headline episode on the opposing 2 weeks, for the sake of digestibility and consistency, we're going to start doing a shorter historical segment every episode, along with other segments sprinkled in afterwards. If you're here for the historical timeline, you'll be getting it every week. And if you're here for everything this show offers other than the historical timeline, you'll be getting that every week too. So, when we last left off our historical timeline, Joe and friends were amidst petitioning a judge for a grand jury hearing to override the legal debacle that was the November Court of Inquiry. The Mormons felt as if they were treated unfairly because they didn't get any opportunity to voice their defense in response to the prosecution. That's not really how courts of inquiry or grand jury hearings work, so it may have felt unfair to them, but that's just how the legal system works. That's how it was set up, and they were going through the correct legal channels, which fittingly landed them in Liberty Jail in the first place. Of course, because the whole Mormon situation was toxic to anybody who came anywhere close to it, Judge Tompkins, who heard the Mormons in the grand jury hearing, heard the prosecution and charged Joe and friends with everything the Court of Inquiry had charged previously. They didn't get anywhere, but nobody wanted the whole thing to go to trial. If a large public trial of the Mormons went down, it would uncover a lot of bad decisions made by the Missouri government because nobody was in the right, and everybody had made illegal mistakes throughout all of 1838 in Missouri, whether they were the Mormons, the typical citizens, or the Missouri government. A solution came in the form of a transfer to Boone County. Sheriff William Morgan took custody of the prisoners, and this is the same Morgan whose house the Mormons had surrounded back in the summer of 1838. And then Joe bribed Morgan and his men with $800 and a bunch of whiskey to let them go. Joe, Hiram, Caleb Baldwin, Alexander McCrae, and Lyman White all effected their escapes and made it to Quincy, Illinois. Upon their arrival, it was a sight to behold. Rigdon had set up shop, renting a small farm from Isaac Galland, who was the same guy who owned all of the land that Joe said that he would buy once he was released. And then Bloody Brigham, of course, had been handling all ecclesiastical matters, including holding a church court, designating over a dozen people who were to be excommunicated for testifying against Joe and the church in the Court of Inquiry, and nobody else had any sense of direction or permanence. The Mormons were beginning their trials and tribulations once again in a brand new place, working with a clean slate in Illinois and Iowa, which wets our palate with the milk in preparation for the meat of today's episode.
As the scriptures say, They must have milk before meat.
It was early May in Quincy, Illinois, when the prophet arrived to the scattered camps, having escaped the custody of the state of Missouri, never to return. The constant fluctuation from cold nights to muggy springtime swamp heat was a nice break from the bitter winter the saints had suffered through during their exodus from Missouri. But it brought on a whole host of new problems. The prophet and his counselors were constantly busy with travels and business meetings and everything related to properly establish the Mormons in Illinois, where they hoped to be safe from persecution. Of the 10,000 plus Mormons who were now settling in parts of Illinois and Iowa, most were eagerly trying to locate themselves to some stable tract of land to plant crops for the season, as they were in desperate need of staple resources. However, among all of the problems the saints were dealing with, controversy once again began wreaking havoc on their beliefs. In 1833, Dr. Philastus Hurlbut, or Dr. Phil as we called him back in episode 29, began his expose of Mormonism, having come into contact with information that the Book of Mormon may have been wholly plagiarized from a manuscript written by one Solomon Spalding. Now, many of you listening may be familiar with this theory, or you may recall it from when we've discussed it previously, but for any new listeners out there and anybody who just doesn't recollect exactly what we're talking about, here's a quick crash course to get us primed for the public letter exchanges published in 1839 that we're going to be reading today. So Hurlbut, Dr. Phil, was a faithful member of the church and was called on a mission to proselyte in Ohio, specifically in a little town named Conneaut. Upon his arrival, he began preaching from the Book of Mormon, which was met with chastisement from the crowd. Many people who'd known a man named Solomon Spalding, who died in 1816 in Pittsburgh, recognized some of the story as similar to what Spalding was writing prior to his death. One man in the crowd, who was a respected justice of the peace in the area, shouted, "Oh, come to pass has come to life again," or something to that effect, implying that came to pass was something Spalding included frequently in his story, which was known as Manuscript Found. I mean, he apparently used it so frequently that people called him Old Come to Pass. But upon hearing this, Dr. Phil Hurlbut went back and asked the Mormon leadership some hard questions about the claims of the Conneaut townsfolk, and was subsequently excommunicated from the church for quote-unquote unchristian-like conduct with women. Then began a years-long research and preaching campaign, where Dr. Phil went to important individuals to get affidavits about Joseph Smith or about Spalding's manuscript. This research, once collected, was sold to Eber Howe, who was the editor of the Painesville Telegraph newspaper, and that was a mere 10 miles away from Kirtland. And subsequently, Mormonism Unveiled was published at the end of 1834 with all of Hurlbut's research intact. This established the foundation for the Spalding theory, claiming that Joseph Smith and Hingepin Rigdon had colluded together to publish the plagiarized Book of Mormon and found the Mormon religion. After Howe's book was published, Pandora's box had been cracked open, and it was only a matter of time before the theory gained enough public awareness that the church leadership could no longer ignore it. Tension was bubbling under the surface, and needed only a small catalyst to once again enter the public eye. In May of 1839, amidst all the chaos of the Mormons beginning to settle Commerce, Illinois, and the surrounding areas, a statement was published in the Boston Recorder and subsequently picked up by many smaller local publications, which reopened investigations into the Spalding theory, finally requiring a response from the Mormon leadership, who had altogether been silent up to this point in response. The statement that made its circulation was a signed affidavit from Spalding's wife, who had remarried soon after Solomon's death, donning the legal name Matilda Spalding Davison. Here are a few excerpts from her statement, and we'll talk about what this means as we go through it. Now, just to let you know, most of today's episode is taken from B.H. Roberts' The Book of Mormon Part 3, and it's hosted on SolomonSpalding.com. There will be a link for it in the show notes. But let's read parts of Matilda Davison's affidavit, because she raises some interesting accusations that essentially lay bare the entire Spalding theory. Now, as I said, this is just kind of a rehashing of the Spalding theory, but it's relevant because in our historical timeline, this is when it comes up. And the impact of this circulating and the Spalding theory being revived definitely has some interesting effects later on. We're going to talk about those. But first, we're going to read Mrs. Davison's statement. Quote, "As the Book of Mormon, or Golden Bible as it was originally called, has excited much attention and is deemed by a certain new sect of equal authority with the sacred scriptures, I think it a duty which I owe to the public to state what I know touching its origin. That its claim to a divine origin are wholly unfounded needs no proof to a mind unperverted by the grossest illusions. That any sane person should rank it higher than any other merely human composition is a matter of the greatest astonishment. It astonishes me today as well. Yet it is received as divine by some who dwell in enlightened New England, and even by those who have sustained the character of devoted Christians. Learning recently that Mormonism had found its way into a church in Massachusetts and has impregnated some with its gross delusions, so that excommunication has been necessary, I am determined to delay no longer in doing what I can to strip the mask from this mother of sin and to lay open this pit of abominations." So, let's just take a step back before finishing reading or continuing to read that statement here. Apparently Mrs. Davison, as she was known, Matilda Spalding Davison, was not a big fan of Mormonism. Wasn't so happy that her husband's work had been appropriated and used as a religious text, and considers Mormonism a gross delusion. So they had moved into a church in Massachusetts, and a few people had converted to Mormonism, and she said, yep, that's enough. These people have been excommunicated because now they're Mormons. So I need to publish this so that she can, quote, strip the mask from this mother of sin and to lay open this pit of abominations. She continues laying out the entire theory. Quote, "Solomon Spalding, to whom I was united in marriage in early life, was a graduate of Dartmouth College, and was distinguished for a lively imagination and a great fondness for history. At the time of our marriage, he resided in Cherry Valley, New York. From this place, we removed to New Salem, Ashtabula County, Ohio, sometimes called Conneaut, as it is situated on Conneaut Creek. Shortly after our removal to this place, his health sunk, and he was laid aside from active labors. In the town of New Salem, there are numerous mounds and forts supposed by many to be the dilapidated dwellings and fortifications of a race now extinct." So Matilda is nice enough to tell us that, hey, there were people that were trying to figure out what was going on with the mound builders. Who built these mounds? Why are they gone? And where did they all go? Apparently germ theory still wasn't a thing. She continues, "These ancient relics arrest the attention of the new settlers and become objects of research for the curious. Numerous implements were found and other articles evincing great skill in the arts. Mr. Spalding, being an educated man and passionately fond of history, took a lively interest in these developments of antiquity, and in order to beguile the hours of retirement and furnish employment for his lively imagination, he conceived the idea of giving an historical sketch of this long-lost race. Their extreme antiquity led him to write in the most ancient style, and as the Old Testament is the most ancient book in the world, he imitated its style as nearly as possible. His sole object in writing this imaginary history was to amuse himself and his neighbors. This was about the year 1812. Hull's surrender at Detroit occurred near the same time, and I recollect the date well from that circumstance. As he progressed in his narrative, the neighbors would come in from time to time to hear portions read, and a great interest in the work was excited among them. It claimed to have been written by one of the lost nation, and to have been recovered from the earth, and assumed the title of manuscript found. The neighbors would often inquire how Mr. Spalding progressed in deciphering the manuscript, and when he had a sufficient portion prepared, he would inform them, and they would assemble to hear it read. He was enabled, from his acquaintance with the classics and ancient history, to introduce many singular names, which were particularly noticed by the people, and could be easily recognized by them. Okay, let's take a second to talk about what she's said so far. So, Davison, Mrs. Matilda Spalding Davison, told everybody that she possibly could in this letter exchange, because this essentially went viral, that her husband was an imaginative guy, and he decided to write a history of the mound builders and the extinct race that built the mounds. And People around knew him to be an imaginative guy and a good writer, and they were eagerly anticipating his published work. So, what they would do is go to gather around in these little, evening gatherings while Mr. Spalding would read his manuscript, or certain portions of it, as those portions were prepared. So many people, obviously, heard his story as he went. Let me take a second to just discuss that for a second. It's not very often that a great author comes out with their magnum opus in apropos of never having published before, right? I mean, most great writers, we have, there are many extant publications that they published long before their magnum opus came along, a fiction or nonfiction writers. So, Mr. Spalding, he had written a few different stories. We know The Frogs of Wyndham was one, and then we have manuscript story, Conneaut Creek. We actually have that. It's known as the Oberlin Manuscript. So he had written a few books, and this book that he was supposedly writing, known as Manuscript Found, was going to be his magnum opus, which we would expect to see if he were a writer. We would expect to see an evolution of his writing and his skills develop slowly over time. That's something that is absent when it comes to Joseph Smith. Joseph, we have accounts from his mother talking about in around 1823 and 24 when he would recite the motives and the warfare of the ancient inhabitants of the continent to his family, around the fire at night, but he never wrote anything prior to the Book of Mormon. It was just he dictated the Book of Mormon, and magically that was his magnum opus, and then it was done, and that was his book. It seems odd that somebody who has never had experience in writing before, who has never written a single publication, we don't have a single letter written by the hand of Joseph Smith prior to the Book of Mormon being published. It may seem odd to think that he just starts out with this magnificent 500-plus page book that lays bare these treatises and arguments that were going on theologically speaking at the time. We might expect that to come out of a writer who has written something before. It just seems odd that it cropped up out of Joseph Smith's mind apropos of nothing. So I'm going to continue reading Mrs. Davison's statement here that was published in the paper, because she does talk about how people came to know that the Spalding manuscript became the Book of Mormon. She goes on to say, quote, Mr. Solomon Spalding had a brother, Mr. John Spalding, residing in the place at the time, who was familiar with the work and repeatedly heard the whole of it read. From New Salem, we removed to Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. Here, Mr. Spalding found a friend and acquaintance in the person of Mr. Patterson, an editor of a newspaper. He exhibited his manuscript to Mr. Patterson, who was very much pleased with it and borrowed it for perusal. He retained it for a long time and informed Mr. Spalding that if he would make out a title page and preface, he would publish it, and it might be a source of profit. Mr. Patterson here, this is me speaking, Mr. Patterson owned a printing press in Pittsburgh, and Mr. Spalding was friends with Mr. Patterson. Mr. Patterson had the completed manuscript found in his possession, and he was just waiting on Solomon Spalding to write a title page and a cover for it. So, that's where the manuscript remained. And hopefully Mr. Patterson and Mr. Spalding were going to publish it as just a fictional book for a source of profit. Great, there's nothing wrong with that. It goes on to say, quote, This Mr. Spalding refused to do. Sidney Rigdon, who has figured so largely in the history of the Mormons, was at the time connected with the printing office of Mr. Patterson, as is well known in that region, and as Rigdon himself has frequently stated, became acquainted with Mr. Spalding's manuscript and copied it. Alright, that's a pretty bold assertion. She just claimed that Mr. Spalding refused to write the title page and the preface, or, I don't know if he refused to do it or if his health waned to the point that he couldn't do it or whatever the case was. But then she goes on to claim that Sidney Rigdon specifically had a connection to the printing office, and that was well known in the area, and that Rigdon himself became acquainted with the manuscript. She said that Rigdon claimed himself has frequently stated that he became acquainted with Mr. Spalding's manuscript and copied it. I don't know where those assertions are, or where we could possibly find evidence for said assertions, but we'll kind of go through that in a minute here. Let me just finish out here with what she says. Quote, "It was a matter of notoriety and interest to all connected with the printing establishment. At length, the manuscript was returned to its author, and soon after we moved to Amity, Washington County, where Mr. Spalding deceased in 1816. The manuscript then fell into my hands and was carefully preserved. It has frequently been examined by my daughter, Miss McKinstry of Monson, Massachusetts, with whom I now reside, and by other friends. After the Book of Mormon came out, a copy of it was taken to New Salem, the place of Mr. Spalding's former residence, and the very place where the manuscript found was written. A woman preacher appointed a meeting there, and in the meeting read and repeated copious extracts from the Book of Mormon. The historical part was immediately recognized by all the older inhabitants as the identical work of Mr. Spalding, in which they had all been so deeply interested years before. Mr. John Spalding was present and recognized perfectly the work of his brother. He was amazed and afflicted that it should have been perverted to so wicked a purpose. His grief found vent in a flood of tears, and he arose on the spot and expressed to the meeting his sorrow and regret that the writings of his deceased brother should be used for a purpose so vile and shocking. The excitement in New Salem became so great that the inhabitants had a meeting and deputed Dr. Philastus Hurlbut, one of their number, to repair to this place and to obtain from me the original manuscript of Mr. Spalding, for the purpose of comparing it with the Mormon Bible, to satisfy their own minds and to prevent their friends from embracing an error so delusive. This was in the year 1834. Dr. Hurlbut brought with him an introduction and request for the manuscript, which was signed by Messrs. Henry Lake and Aaron Wright, and others with all of whom I was acquainted, as they were my neighbors when I resided at New Salem. I am sure that nothing would grieve my husband more, were he living, than the use which has been made of his work. The air of antiquity which was thrown about the composition doubtless suggested the idea of converting it to the purposes of this delusion. Thus, an historical romance, with the addition of a few pious expressions and extracts from the sacred scriptures, has been construed into a new Bible and palmed off upon a company of poor deluded fanatics as divine. I have given the previous brief narration that this work of deep deception and wickedness may be searched to the foundation and the authors exposed to the contempt and execration they so justly deserved. Signed, Matilda Davison. End quote. This public affidavit went viral throughout local newspapers where Mormons were present. The Spalding theory had legs already, but this letter lit a fire under its ass and really got the whole thing running. Of course, the Mormon leadership could no longer sit idly by and let this blow up without some kind of answer. If true, the Spalding theory would cripple any credibility Joe and Rigdon had, and rightfully, people would leave the church in droves. Just to quickly reiterate, this was the last thing the Mormons needed. The leadership were fugitives of Ohio and now Missouri, and the Mormons were only just beginning the arduous reconstruction process needed to turn the little chit-splat swampland Commerce, Illinois into Nauvoo, their new homestead. A resurgence in the Spalding theory was just one more thing the leadership didn't need to deal with right now, among everything else that was stressing them out and stretching their resources to the absolute maximum. Rigdon wrote a scathing response published 9 days later. When I read through it, I can't help but think he maybe should have put more thought into this. Maybe slept on the letter a few nights to let it brew before sending it out. But I don't think Rigdon was always that calculated, especially as his health still wasn't great thanks to his confinement in Liberty and the trials he'd been suffering ever since. The refutation began with condemning the paper for publishing such dribble and personally attacking Matilda Davison for publishing such lies and running in league with the basest of liars like Dr. Philastus Hurlbut. After Mormonism Unveiled was published in 1834, Mormon persecution began to really ramp up, but it was a two-way street. As with any institutionalized falsehood, there were people on the outside of Mormonism looking in and questioning its validity who published stuff like this in response to what they found. From the time of 1834 to when Rigdon's response was published in 1839, a lot happened when it comes to the, so-called Mormon persecution. The saints had built their temple in Kirtland, and accusations of the prophet's infidelity became more frequent. They'd established the Kirtland Safety Society anti-banking company and crashed their own local economy. The leadership had been excommunicated from the Kirtland Church and were forced to flee to Missouri, and then the entire Missouri Mormon War had blown up and everything was scorched in the aftermath. Some of the most trusted leaders in the church had betrayed Joe and the leadership and were excommunicated and chased from their homes in response. Chaos and pandemonium were the only constants ruling Mormonism. Just as the Mormons were trying to get settled down from everything they dealt with in Missouri, this public exchange happened. Did Rigdon actually refute the claims made by Davison and the Spalding theory at large? Well, let's read his refutation and boil it down to see if we can't analyze it with a skeptical eye. Skepticize it, if you will. Published from Commerce, May 27, 1839. This was before it was renamed Nauvoo. Quote, Messrs. Bartlett and Sullivan, in your paper on the 18th instant, I see a letter signed by somebody calling herself Matilda Davison, pretending to give the origin of Mormonism, as she is pleased to call it. All right, so what we're going to do, as I read through this, I'm going to just take occasional pauses to hash out what we are seeing here and hopefully point out some logical fallacies that occur. So in this very first section, this is textbook attacking credibility, both of the paper who published Davison's statement as well as Davison herself. This is a common tactic. Even in law, if you can successfully discredit a witness's credibility, it renders their claims moot. Rigdon didn't establish why she or the paper weren't credible. He just helplessly thrashed against both in his very opening sentence. Then he goes on to say, as she is pleased to call it, relating a moonshine story about a certain Solomon Spalding. All right, so Rigdon paints this entire thing as an absurdity by calling it a moonshine story. This attack is unprovoked and represents a personal incredulity logical fallacy. He claims that it's absurd by calling it an absurd story, but he doesn't establish why it's absurd. And it goes on to claim, talking about Solomon Spalding, a creature with the knowledge of whose earthly existence I'm entirely indebted to this production, for surely until Dr. Philasus Hurlbut informed me that such a being lived at some former period, I had not the most distant knowledge of his existence. So this, what he just did there, is a thinly veiled form of denial known as distancing. It's an impossible thing to do, but if Rigdon can prove that he never knew of Spalding or he had never heard of that name until Hurlbut brought it to his attention, it would definitely punch a gaping hole in this theory, right? The problem is, Spalding wasn't alive to validate or refute this claim, nor were anybody that were associated with the Patterson printing press. If he were alive at this time, somebody could go ask him if he ever knew Sidney Rigdon or if he'd ever even heard the name, but Spalding had died 23 years prior to this letter exchange, making it a little bit of a challenge to prove or falsify Rigdon's claims that he had never known Solomon Spalding. He goes on to say, and all I know about his character is the opinion I form from what is attributed to his wife in obtruding my name upon the public in the manner in which she is said to have done, by trying to make the public believe that I had knowledge of the ignorant, and, according to her own testimony, the lying scribblings of her deceased husband. For if her testimony is to be credited, her pious husband in his lifetime wrote a bundle of lies for the righteous purpose of getting money. How many lies he had told for the same purpose while he was preaching, she has not so kindly informed us, but we are at liberty to draw our own conclusions. For he that would write lies to get money would also preach lies for the same object. This isn't a formal logical fallacy that I could find. Maybe it actually exists, but it gets at the heart of a sinister kind of discrediting where a person asserts that somebody's claims are made purely for financial gain, that they are lying to get money. Rigdon asserts that Spalding wrote lies for the purpose or the righteous purpose of getting money, but that misses the point and it's a red herring to the main point. Davison stated explicitly that Spalding was an imaginative person who needed a creative outlet in his retirement and thus took to writing fiction. She said that explicitly. People write fictional books to sell all the time, and claiming that it somehow makes them a liar is a pure ad hominem attack and doesn't lend any credibility to Rigdon's entire refutation. It continues on. This being the only information which I have or ever had of the said Reverend Solomon Spalding, I, of necessity, have but a very light opinion of him as a gentleman. When he says light opinion, he's saying I do not like him. A very light opinion of him as a gentleman, a scholar, or a man of piety. For had he been either, he certainly would have taught his pious wife not to lie, nor unite herself with adulterers, liars, and the basest of mankind. All right. So what happened there? Putting aside the blatant misogyny of Rigdon basically saying that Spalding should have kept a tighter leash on his wife, Rigdon again is distancing himself, and he uses ad hominem attacks on Matilda and Solomon Spalding with this statement. We still have yet to find a single solid refutation which can't be boiled down to some form of logical fallacy. He continues on saying, it is only necessary to say, in relation to the whole story about Spalding's writings being in the hands of Mr. Patterson, who was in Pittsburgh and who is said to have kept a printing office, and my saying that I was concerned in the said office, etc., is the most base of lies without even a shadow of truth. Okay. This is denial. This is just a blatant, out-and-out denial. Now, denial doesn't necessarily imply lying, nor that the opposite of the denial is inherently true. Denial is something special in and of itself. There are a few types of denial, and they cause all sorts of different public perceptions when the denial is made. When a person denies something, it can be done knowing full well that it's not true, making it an active lie. Or they can deny something out of ignorance or stubbornness. If somebody is, like denying a death in the family or an addiction or an affair or something, they aren't doing so as an active lie. They're just in a mental state where the truth, as other people see it looking at them, doesn't seem to affect the person making the denial. But there's another kind of denial where it's knowingly done in blatant contradiction to the truth, and that's a lie. Then there are also denials which are true. A false accusation can be made, and sometimes denial is the only possible answer, and the person is denying something to exonerate themselves. But on the flip side of a public denial is how the public perceives the denial. What seems to happen, and this is just what I've seen, so I could be wrong, this could just be my own subjective perspective, but it seems as if denials tend to polarize the public for or against the person issuing the denial. Let's examine Rigdon's denial here to lay out what I mean by that. When he publicly denied this, the whole thing, that all of Spalding theory and everything, and his connection to Mr. Patterson in the printing press is the most base of lies without even a shadow of truth, that's just a denial. When he says that, it's likely that the people who considered the Spalding theory true at the time just said to themselves, well, of course they would deny it, because it conflicts with their narrative and their truth claims, But on the other side of that, people who considered the Spalding theory false, most of which were probably faithful Mormons, probably said, well, of course they would deny these claims because they aren't true. So the denial doesn't actually get us any closer or further away from the truth. It's just the only response that the church could issue to these accusations, and it's all that we can really expect. And I guess it kind of boils down to a question. Was this denial true? Only two conclusions exist. Either Rigdon's denial is true and the entire Spalding theory is bunk, or his denial was a blatant lie, making the Spalding theory true. So let's examine the last few claims that Rigdon made as a block, because he seems to contradict himself here. Before reading it, we need to understand that the Spalding theory hinges on Spalding's manuscript being left at the Patterson printing press before the press was dissolved in 1823. If the Spalding manuscript wasn't at Patterson's printing press, or Rigdon truly had no association with the press, it was a bookstore and printing press, then there's no direct way for the manuscript to have fallen into Rigdon's hands, and the whole theory becomes a little bit less tenable. But let's read the rest of his refutation here. Quote, "There was no man by the name of Patterson during my residence at Pittsburgh who had a printing office." Okay, we'll get to that in a second. "What might have been before I lived there, I know not. Mr. Robert Patterson, I was told, had owned a printing office before I lived in that city, but had been unfortunate in business, and failed before my residence there. This Mr. Patterson, who was a Presbyterian preacher, I had a very slight acquaintance with during my residence in Pittsburgh. He was then acting under an agency in the book and stationery business, and was the owner of no property of any kind, printing office, or anything else during the time I resided in the city." End quote. All right, what does this mean? Rigdon began saying that he never knew anybody named Robert Patterson to have owned a printing press during his time in Pittsburgh. Then he goes on to claim that he had a passing acquaintance with Robert Patterson, but that he wasn't even in the printing business during the time that Rigdon resided in Pittsburgh. This is a bold-faced lie. Now, I say that because Rigdon was likely friends with a man named Silas Ingalls, who was the printer for the Patterson print shop, and we have Rigdon's name on an unclaimed letter list from the Pittsburgh post office from 1816, right before Spalding's death. There's also Solomon Spalding's on that name on that same unclaimed letters list, so we have evidence of Rigdon and Spalding being in the same town at the same time. But it wasn't until 1825 that Rigdon moved from Pennsylvania to Ohio. And in that window of time from 1816 to 1825, Patterson purchased and ran the Pittsburgh printing press into the ground. Rigdon was living near Pittsburgh the entire time the Patterson printing press and bookstore was running, and the Pittsburgh postmaster's daughter, who was working full-time in the post office, said that she had seen Rigdon and Silas Ingalls together in the post office talking to each other more than once. So are we to truly believe that Rigdon, a lover of printed materials and history and Bible tracts, had no knowledge of or connection to the Patterson printing press and bookstore the entire time he was living near Pittsburgh, even though he was friends with an employee of the store? And that question even ignores the fact that Rigdon worked as a tanner for many of those years that he was living in that area. It was when he was doing his apprenticeship as a preacher and trying to work a full day job as a tanner in addition to being the preacher. But one of the primary uses for tanned hides back then was for book covers, meaning that the Patterson printing press was likely one of Rigdon's main clients. All of this to say, that was a bold-faced lie. And the public perception of this public exchange between Davison and Sidney Rigdon was what was most important. It's how the public saw what had happened. Now, this is where we get into some tricky ground, because we don't have any numbers on how this whole public debacle affected membership in the church. We don't know if this caused a bunch of people to question and then subsequently leave the church due to these unanswerable questions raised with this renewed resurgence of the Spalding theory in 1839. The actual membership numbers that we have were largely recounted by the Mormon leadership, or as just like a random number some random person included in their journal about the saints being, 10 or 15,000 strong. That's hardly a scientific heuristic. Granted, it may have been hard to track down exactly how many people were following Joe and Rigdon and the Quorum from Kirtland to Missouri in the first place, and then trying to figure out what percentage of those people stuck with the church through the exodus to Illinois is another challenge in and of itself. I mean, some Mormons living in Missouri just renounced their membership and remained in Missouri instead of following the rest of the saints out to Quincy, Illinois. Then, if we add in all of the pressures that caused Mormons to disaffect in the aftermath of the Missouri Mormon War, the average, what we might call, chapel Mormon today, who's just attending and paying their tithings faithfully, having all of this pressure comes to see Matilda Davison publish this claim that the whole damn Book of Mormon was taken off some dead guy back in Pittsburgh, and the leadership really doesn't have an answer beyond denial and ad hominem attacks. this whole tide and force of history here must have caused at least somebody to question just what the hell was going on here. And let's just run on that for a minute. How could we know the impact this public controversy had on the believing Mormon population? The Mormons in Missouri had been recounted as 8,000 to 10,000 by Mormon accounts, but there wasn't a Missouri census performed in that brief window of March to December of 1838, so we don't know what the population numbers actually were, and of course many Mormons didn't have actual homesteads from which to conduct a census, even if a census were performed in that little window. The truth of the matter is, trying to estimate Mormon population at any given time was a bit of a challenge throughout all of its history. Now, I'm going to read a quick excerpt from an article titled, How Large Was the Population of Nauvoo? By Susan Easton Black. This is published through BYU Studies, Volume 35, Issue 2. In just a few short paragraphs, she gets to the problem with population estimates and how hard it is to really nail down for sure. So follow the show notes for a link to this article. Quote, various estimates have been given by many historians for the population of Nauvoo from 1839 to 1846. Admittedly, demographic descriptions of that area are riddled with statistical inadequacies, yet, while these difficulties have been recognized by historians, they have not been resolved to the extent possible through research. While historians all agree that the population of Nauvoo rapidly increased between 1839 and 1846, they either describe this growth with undocumented figures, avoid mentioning any concrete figures, or cast doubt on the figures they have cited. For example, Robert Flanders simply states, quote, the population of Illinois trebled during each decade between 1820 to 1840 and doubled between 1840 and 1850. When describing the LDS population, he quotes others. The Mormons reported a population of 10,000 by late 1842. Thomas Ford, in his History of Illinois, wrote that there were, by the end of the year, 16,000 Mormons altogether in Hancock County. On another occasion, he quotes from an October 1843 issue of the Nauvoo Neighbor, in which Nauvoo is designated the Great Emporium of the West, the center of all centers, a population of 15,000 souls congregated from the four quarters of the globe. Two other historians, David Miller and Della Miller, accurately assert that when the Mormons first arrived there in the spring of 1839, approximately 100 persons occupied the whole peninsula. By 1845, the official Illinois census showed that the city had grown to nearly 12,000. But they offer the caveat that most contemporary accounts, both Mormon and non-Mormon, regularly overestimated the populations, sometimes stretching the figure up to more than 20,000. The Millers mistakenly cite the January 7, 1846 issue of the Warsaw Signal, which they interpret as saying that the population of Nauvoo was 22,600. The Signal was actually reporting on all of Hancock County. Church historian B.H. Roberts left room for a range of population sizes. Early in 1843, Nauvoo's population was variously computed from 12 to 16,000. Later, he concludes, when the Exodus of the Saints was enforced, Nauvoo had a population variously estimated from 12 to 20,000. Roberts' overestimation is even further exceeded by the Illinois Department of Conservation, which announced that Nauvoo was Illinois' largest city with a population of 27,000 in 1844. As Nauvoo's Mormon era is recalled by historians, one is left wondering if a more precise and informative statistics about Nauvoo's population from 1839 to 1846 can be found. Since numbers range from 12,000 to 27,000, a need for greater accuracy is evident. End quote. All of that said, how could any historian or group of historians actually figure out what the real numbers are? And as an extension of that question, and why I read that excerpt in the first place, how could we truly know the impact of the Spalding theory surfacing again in this public exchange? The way I see it, Rigdon's denial could be taken two ways, and means one of two mutually exclusive things. The believers and non-believers in Mormonism probably fell down on either side of the issue, with few who questioned making their opinion apparent by abandoning the church, an impact which we have no way of actually gauging. Now, I doubt anybody was convinced that the Book of Mormon was true who otherwise weren't when they read this letter exchange in the local newspapers, but that impact probably cut the other way. It could be understood that many people who did believe in the Book of Mormon and saw this public exchange and saw that there were no logical refutations that Rigdon could offer may have caused some questioning in their mind. But his denial, Rigdon's whole denial of this entire thing and all of the logical fallacies he relied upon that we kind of parsed through here, that can only mean one of the following two things. Either, number one, Rigdon's denial was true and the Spalding theory is bunk, or, number two, his denial was bold-faced lying and the Spalding theory is therefore true. There is no other interpretation of the facts, and I don't think that that's a false dichotomy fallacy. Now, I'll simply ask you as a listener to skepticize that dichotomy for yourself and ask what makes the most sense. But sense-making wasn't always Rigdon's strong suit, as he was known to be rather verbose in his delivery, obviously. If there truly was nothing to the entire Spalding theory, and Rigdon were a rational human being capable of refuting these accusations without devolving into a cesspool of name-calling and logical fallacies, what might that open exchange look like? Please allow some brief artistic liberty as I try to channel my inner Rigdon here with what I think would have been a better refutation that doesn't rely on logical fallacies. Messrs. Bartlett and Sullivan, in your paper on the 18th instance, I see a letter signed by Matilda Davison, pretending to give the origin of Mormonism, as she is pleased to call it, by making accusations about a certain Solomon Spalding, a man with whom I have only ever had passing acquaintance, for surely Dr. Philasus Hurlbut informed me that the man had written by his own hand at some former period a history of the former inhabitants of this continent. I had not the most distant knowledge of its existence, and all I know of Mr. Spalding's character is the opinion I form from what is attributed to his wife in obtruding my name upon the public in the manner in which she is said to have done by trying to make the public believe that I had taken his history and made scripture of it, and according to her own testimony, the imaginative scribblings of her deceased husband are now our Book of Mormon, for if her testimony is to be credited, her pious husband in his lifetime wrote a bundle of fictions for the purpose of getting money. How many stories he had told for the same purpose while he was preaching, she has not so kindly informed us. But we are at liberty to draw our own conclusions, for he that would write stories to get money would make a good fiction author, which has no place in writing in the name of the Almighty. This being the only information I have or ever had of the Reverend Solomon Spalding, I, of necessity, have but a very kind opinion of him as a gentleman, a scholar, and a man of piety. For he had many friends and few known enemies in this world, but wasted his time in fictitious pursuits for the purpose of getting money. It is only necessary to say, in relation to the whole story about Spalding's writings being in the hands of Mr. Patterson, who was in Pittsburgh and who is said to have kept a printing office, and my saying that I was concerned in the said office, etc., is a false accusation. There was a man by the name of Patterson during my residence in Pittsburgh who had a printing office. What business Mr. Patterson and Mr. Spalding conducted before I lived there, I know not. Mr. Robert Patterson had owned a printing office while I lived in that city, but had been unfortunate in business and failed, and was, therefore, dissolved and sold to one who may make a better run of the business of printing in Pittsburgh. This Mr. Patterson, I am informed, was awaiting Mr. Spalding's title page of the fiction to be published. He was then purchasing hides from the work of my hands in the book and stationery business, and published a great deal many books while we conducted business together. Now I feel it time to share a bit on the real story of how our Golden Bible, as many call it, as it is the divine work of the Almighty sent to deliver us from the bonds of iniquity in our last days, for Zion shall be established to receive our Savior when his time is come to set at defiance our laws and our religion, for our Book of Mormon brings all those who read it closer to their Savior and promises everlasting everlasting life in the great realm that awaits those who seek to obey his will. The prophet, for none other word can scarcely describe the righteousness and persecution this man has had to endure, did see the face of our Lord God with Jesus Christ at his right hand, and they did wish that he would not join any religion, as their creeds are abomination and their professors are corrupt. And it was this divine calling of a young and unlearned man by which our Lord moves his will upon us to bring us closer to the Savior. And soon it was by the power of God and not of man that this unlearned man delivered our Book of Mormon to be the salvation to this generation of Gentiles and all those who feel a quickening of the Spirit upon reading its pages. And it was by this mechanism that the Lord gave us the Book of Mormon, and there can be no natural explanation, as it was a book delivered to us in the same manner the commandments were delivered to Moses on Mount Sinai, as the Lord speaks to his modern-day prophets the way he speaks unto the prophets of old. As the prophets of old were directed by revelation from the Lord, so too are we directed by his will and power through revelation to build up the New Jerusalem unto this generation and our progenitors for generations to come. Okay, so maybe I won't channel into the point of like one of his swoonings, but there we go. That was my Rigdon channeling. That was a non-combative refutation of the Spalding theory, which doesn't rely on myriad logical fallacies, and it sticks with the story as the church claims it today. Now, we've gone over the Spalding theory in the past, and I try to make no bones about the fact that the vast majority of credible historians and scholars consider it bunk. But I reserve a small credulous part in the back of my mind where the Spalding theory lives. Needless to say, seeing Rigdon's blatant denial, which relies heavily on ad hominem attacks and bold-faced lying, definitely makes that small credulous part scream in excitement that there might just be something to the Spalding theory. But if you're a supporter on patreon.com/nakedmormonism, be sure to listen in, because this episode I'm going to read the introduction to the Spalding manuscript that we have. This is Manuscript Story, Conneaut Creek, the opening section to it, for Patreon subscribers only. And that's going to do it for the historical portion for today. Sometimes it's necessary to rehash these things when they come up, like when it comes to the Spalding theory. You know, we covered an entire week of the historical timeline in today's episode, and it was just centered around this public letter exchange between Matilda Davison and Sidney Rigdon. Well, yeah, sometimes the history is a little bit dense, and we have to take it apart piece by piece. But for the rest of today's episode, I planned on airing a conversation that I had with Professor CJ of the Dangerous History podcast. But in light of last week's episode, that conversation is going to be tabled until next week's episode. If you want to know who I'm talking to for next week's show, be sure to check out the Dangerous History podcast as a bit of a primer to our conversation. Instead, I want to answer some feedback I received from last week's interview exchange with Charone Frankel of the Habeas Humor podcast. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about a topic that we covered in the Patreon-only version of the conversation, and feel free to listen to that version if you're a patron, and if you're not a patron and think this show is worth it, consider tossing us $1 or $2 an episode. You know, that's less than a cup of coffee per month on patreon.com/nakedmormonism, and you get access to all the extended episodes. But to get everybody up to speed, Charone and I talked a bit about religious exemptions in the law, and whether or not they were a good thing. Now, to be clear, Charone claimed that all religious exemptions should be removed as they create a religious class who have certain privileges that non-religious people don't enjoy. That's inherently unfair and a biased system. While I didn't actually disagree with Charone, I went on a screed about how some religious exemptions may be rational when it comes to things like the Native American church using peyote, but of course I applied the situation to a hypothetical version of Mormonism, which gets to the hallucinogenic roots of Mormonism. Of course, because I'm not talking on the fly now, and I'm able to listen back to our conversation and think things through a little bit, and I have show notes in front of me, I'm able to be a bit more calculated in my words and logic. But essentially, Charone asked if I thought that religious exemptions should be allowed, a question that I didn't actually answer at all. We just kind of rabbit trailed after she asked that until the conversation was essentially over and she was plugging her show. We didn't have any disagreement, but we didn't come to an agreement. And it's, listening back, it's kind of frustrating and hard to figure out why I never directly answered the question. And I think it kind of boils down to the fact that we were kind of having two different conversations. Now, what I mean by that is she was talking about eradicating religious exemptions, an issue that I'll talk through in a minute here. Well, I was talking more about removing laws which I perceive to be unfair. A subsect of those laws I consider unfair are certain drug use laws. The initial religious exemptions which allowed the Native American church to legally carry and use peyote is a just exemption, in my opinion. That seems rational. My justification for that exemption is the natives were using peyote here for thousands of years before Europeans colonized and said that using peyote was illegal. And I don't think it's fair to legislate against the practices of the Native Americans when us Europeans are the immigrants living on their land who made the laws against peyote in the first place. The point Charone was making apropos of our discussion about cults in the FLDS is that once somebody cries religion, they suddenly don't have to follow all kinds of labor laws and child protection laws and wage laws and everything which they otherwise would be prosecuted for if they weren't a religion. And I totally agree with her on that point. I mean, for example, Sea Org, the worker bees of Scientology, get paid something like 60 cents an hour or something for their work, and Scientology is never prosecuted for these heinous violations of labor laws. By extension, the LDS Church doesn't pay the majority of their sales force or the people who staff their visitor centers because those people are all missionaries. They're paying the church to be able to work for the church. Beyond that, the church has a separate box on the tithing slip where you can donate to the missionary fund specifically, which is then absorbed into the towering entity that is the LDS Church, and then they appropriate the funds as they see fit. These religious exemptions are abused by everything from multi-billion-dollar corporations masquerading as churches down to the lowliest cult leader who files for 501c3 tax exemption status all around the world, and it's simply not right. But the issue goes a little bit deeper than that. And follow me down this rabbit hole for a minute because I'm going to bring it back around to my conversation with Charone in a second here. Take the seemingly perpetual fight the FFRF is waging against the IRS for religious exemptions in the 501c3 tax status organizations. This is merely my cursory understanding of the situation, so I'll probably get some of the details wrong, but the overall point stands. The FFRF, the Freedom From Religion Foundation, sued the IRS back in 2014 because certain religions were enjoying nonprofit filing allowances, which the FFRF didn't enjoy. If I understand it correctly, non-religious nonprofits have to file stricter finances with the IRS than religious nonprofits, which the FFRF complained caused undue burden on them and causes preferential treatment to religious organizations strictly because they are religious. Now, personally speaking, I wear a leather wristband from Be Secular with the First Amendment on it for a reason, because it's very important to keep that wall of separation between church and state. The FFRF also looped in the fact that the Pulpit Freedom Sunday, where religions film themselves giving political speeches from the pulpit and then send it to the IRS, daring them to prosecute them, was some form of religious exemption because other nonprofits like the FFRF lose their tax-exempt status when they politic from the pulpit the way these churches are. Everything that I just talked about all represent religious exemptions, which I consider egregious violations of fair treatment of all citizens, regardless of religion, creed, culture, or ethnicity, which flies in the face of the Constitution. I think anybody looking at this situation can agree that religions are being treated with undue allowances that their non-religious counterparts don't enjoy, and that's a problem. I didn't articulate that point in my conversation with Charone as I look back on it, and it seems like a foregone conclusion and a point not worth belaboring, though. Where the conversation evolved after that is where I think some of the nuance exists, and it came in the form of me asking Charone what religions should be classified as if we remove all religious exemptions. The fact of the matter is, religions aren't going anywhere anytime soon, and I looped that reasoning into my question. As much as firebrand atheists wish we could live in a world without religion, that reality seems at least a few centuries, if not millennia, away if the trends continue to follow the same path they've followed since we've had writing and religion. Don't get me wrong, I dream of the day when non-religious people outpopulate the religious, but that doesn't seem like a reality for the foreseeable future, and I like to live in reality and deal with it rationally. Just as Utah laws are inextricably tied to the religion of the people who make and enforce the laws, the same trend follows for American laws and Christianity in general. There's no easy way to separate government and religion retroactively. We can only safeguard against further grievances of that nature. Hypotheticals of what our government would look like without any ties to religion are so far away from reality that I don't have much use for wasting the intellectual resources on dreaming up what that might look like. That's why I was asking Charone her opinion of how religions should be classified if there aren't any laws allowing them special privileges. But let me back up a little bit and walk you through why that seems like a relevant question to me. Look, if you get a big enough group of people together with similar ideas, it's not long before somebody calls them a religion. One of the paramount arguments between atheists and theists is whether or not atheism is a religion. It's not, but that's still a common argument. In the past, I've attended a philosophy meetup here in Seattle, which meets every Friday night at a bar in Capitol Hill. They have their weekly gathering where they come together and share ideas and information for the purpose of expanding knowledge and fraternizing in general. If you pump a few hundred people into that group and change the meeting day from Friday to Sunday, this philosophy group really begins to look like a religion. If you get a few firebrand determinists in there and the philosophy group down the road has a few firebrand proponents of free will, you have two competing cultures of philosophy right next door to each other, and things may start to look like a modern-day Palestine. With the exception that, most people are inclined in philosophy and also are humanists, and I really don't see humanists bombing each other in any possible hypothetical, but the analogy still holds here. Why do we do this? Why do we gather together into groups of like-minded individuals? Simple. For better or worse, we're a groupthink social species. I've said this on the podcast before. I credit the church with providing structure and community to my upbringing, which I otherwise would have missed out on had I not grown up Mormon, and why I consider myself culturally Mormon. Such is the case with any culture. I don't agree with all the baggage and the useless horseshit the church heaps on the shoulders of their parishioners, but there can be no doubt that religion provides some social good or fills some kind of cultural gap. That's the reason religion isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and why so many people are willing to live with cognitive dissonance about their beliefs because they are reaping the social benefits. Now, I've received a small handful of emails in the past from listeners who say that they wish they could leave the church, but if they did, it would be the end of important relationships in their life or their job, so they just grin and bear all the stupid shit like misogyny and homophobia. My point is, and why I went down this rabbit hole in the first place, religions are fundamentally different from other entities. Groups of people meeting together deserve nonprofit benefits and exemptions that for-profit groups shouldn't have. Let's face it, no philosophy group or religion is actually turning out any tangible product or service. Their benefits are much harder to quantify. And the IRS understands this fundamental difference in entity structuring, which is why they created the 501c tax exemptions status code. And these are the entities which are included in the 501c3 tax code. But the exemptions go to much broader definitions all through 501c 1 through 29 and also into the 501d through J through K through N subclauses. This is specifically 501c3, and this is taken from the 501 Wikipedia page, so, take that for what it's worth. But it says, quote, 501c3 exemption includes religious, educational, charitable, scientific, literary, testing for public safety, to foster national or international amateur sports competition, or prevention of cruelty to children or animals organizations, end quote. An hypothetical philosophy meetup group with a few hundred people needing tax-exempt status doesn't necessarily fall into any of those categories. They're not really scientific, they're not strictly educational, they're not literary. but they're also not a religion. Unless you try to loop them into one of those categories. But, I don't know if a bunch of 20 to 30 somethings getting together and drinking a beer actually fulfills any of the needed criteria for a philosophy meetup to fit into any of those categories. This is a specific religious exemption in the tax code which may not apply to other similar groups. But if a group is able to classify itself as a religion, they get the exemptions. How would the people involved in that philosophy group feel about being considered a religion because they don't fit better into any of the other 501c3 categories? And, I bet there might be some arguments flying around about what truly makes a religion, but a philosophy group doesn't fit that important requirement to be considered a religion, which is that higher power part of the equation. Philosophy groups can be an amalgamation of all kinds of people of different belief spectrum. The point I'm making is that gathering in a group has an incredible amount of social benefit, and maybe it's time to reconsider the definition of religion to maybe include any group of people that gather on a scheduled basis to fraternize and share ideas. The entire etymology of the word religion doesn't need to be tainted by the theological aspect, as language is fluid and definitions change to meet our needs. And, I guess that's kind of my conclusion and why I wanted to talk about this briefly. Religions aren't going anywhere anytime soon. Theologies are. Let's appropriate the term religion, or use a better word that describes any group of people who meet together with each other for all of the benefits that community inspires. And that's going to do it for our episode today. Hopefully everybody's all right with the new format of these shorter segments and having a historical section as well as an additional segment for every episode. We don't have any new patrons to thank today, but there are a few old PayPal donations that I've forgotten to mention for so long, and I want to thank a few people: Derek Larson, Jay Mumford, and Philip Saulnier. Thank you all very much for those PayPal donations. Those are deeply appreciated, and my apologies for neglecting to thank you for those long since. It just occurred to me that I haven't mentioned those in quite some time. But I think we are all set for today. I need to thank a few people who keep this show going in the back end, and without them, this could not be a possibility. I'll start off by thanking the real Emma Hale for running the Twitter handle. Thank you so much for doing that and keeping the conversation alive and reposting there. Thank you to Jason Camo for providing music in the show used with his permission. Go to aloststateofmind.com to hear more of his music there. I need to thank Craig Keeling for providing the artwork used in the show. Go to weirdmormonshit.com to see his blog there, and lots of Weird Mormon shit. Of course, I need to thank the law offices of P. Andrew Torres for providing legal counsel for the show and keeping everything running on the back end as well. And, of course, once again, a big thanks to all the patrons who do keep the show running. This wouldn't be an endeavor without your hard-earned cash. Thank you so much. But most importantly, if not for all of the wondiferous listeners out there, this wouldn't be a thing. So, thank you all so much for listening and lending me your ear. I hope to talk to you next time, here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2017, all rights reserved.